The security footage went viral in 6 hours. 47 million views. A pregnant woman collapsing at a Beverly Hills charity gala while her billionaire husband stood frozen, watching his mistress press a stiletto heel into her stomach. But that viral moment, that was just the beginning. What the cameras didn't show was the 3 months of psychological warfare before that night. The systematic destruction of a woman who thought marriage meant safety, and the twist nobody saw coming, a secret so dark it would bring down an entire empire built on 40,000 deaths. I'm about to tell you the full story, the one that never made the news. But before we start, hit that like button if you believe karma is real. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And subscribe because this channel tells the stories others won't touch. This is Clara Bennett's War, and it starts now. The security camera footage played on every screen in America. Grainy, silent, horrifying. A charity gala at the Peninsula Beverly Hills, crystal chandeliers, designer gowns, champagne towers catching the light like frozen waterfalls. And there, in the center of the ballroom, a woman in an ivory maternity dress collapsed to the marble floor. Her name was Clara Bennett. She was 6 months pregnant, and the woman standing over her, stiletto heel pressed deliberately into her swollen stomach, was her husband's mistress. 47 million views in 6 hours. But here's what the video didn't show. The 3 months before that moment, the systematic destruction of a woman who thought marriage meant safety, the calculated cruelty of powerful men who treated lives like chess pieces. This isn't a story about revenge, it's a story about survival. Clara Bennett grew up in Pasadena, the daughter of a nurse and a high school teacher. She earned a scholarship to UCLA, graduated summa cum laude, and founded a nonprofit supporting maternal health in underserved communities. She believed in fairness, in truth, in the fundamental goodness of people. Then she met Shane Matthews. He was 45, a pharmaceutical CEO, heir to the Matthews empire. His father, Walter Matthews, had built a fortune manufacturing opioids in the 90s. By the time the lawsuits came, the family had already moved their money offshore. 40,000 deaths, $12 billion, a slap on the wrist. Shane found Clara at a fundraiser. She was presenting data on maternal mortality rates among Black women in Los Angeles County. He listened with those penetrating blue eyes, nodding at all the right moments. Afterward, he wrote a check for $500,000. 6 months later, they were married. Clara thought she'd won the lottery. A man who cared about her work, who wanted to amplify her voice, who whispered that he'd been waiting his whole life for someone real. She was 28. He was 45. She didn't see the red flags. The first year was perfect. Shane folded her nonprofit into the Matthews Foundation, promising $10 million in annual funding. They bought a house in Malibu, all glass and ocean views. Clara stopped working 70-hour weeks. She slept past dawn for the first time in her adult life. Then she got pregnant. It was a Sunday morning in March. Clara stood in their bathroom, staring at 2 pink lines. Her hands shook. They'd never discussed children. Shane had always deflected with jokes about his age, his schedule, his fear of turning into his father. But when she told him, his face lit up. He spun her around the kitchen, laughing. He called his father immediately. Walter's voice crackled through the speakerphone, cold and measured. "Congratulations, son, this changes everything." Clara didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. 2 weeks later, she found the hotel receipt. It had fallen from Shane's jacket pocket while she was taking his suits to the dry cleaner, the Beverly Wilshire. March 14th, the same day she'd told him about the pregnancy. Room service for 2, champagne, chocolate-covered strawberries. Her stomach dropped. She logged into their shared credit card account. There were dozens more, hotels, restaurants, jewelry purchases she'd never seen, all charged to a card she didn't know existed. The affair had been going on for 2 years. Clara confronted him that night. Shane stood in their living room, tie loosened, bourbon in hand. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He simply said, "You're being paranoid. Pregnancy hormones." She called her brother Owen. He was an investigative journalist at The Atlantic, older by 7 years, fiercely protective. He'd never liked Shane, never trusted the Matthews family. Now Clara understood why. But Shane intercepted the call. He took her phone calmly, without raising his voice. Your brother hates me. He's always hated me. Don't let him poison you with conspiracy theories. Clara felt the walls closing in. She had no prenup. Shane's lawyers had assured her it wasn't necessary, that it would insult his commitment. She'd trusted him. She'd signed papers she barely read. Her nonprofit was now technically owned by the Matthews Foundation. Her name was on nothing. She was trapped. That night, lying in bed beside her husband, Clara placed a hand on her belly. The baby fluttered, a tiny kick against her palm, and she whispered the question that would haunt her for months. What have I done? 3 catastrophes arrived in rapid succession, each one designed to break her. The first came on a Tuesday morning. Clara went to Whole Foods, the same store she'd shopped at for years. Her card declined. She tried another, declined, a third, declined, humiliated. She left the cart and drove home. Shane was in his office on a conference call. She waited outside the door, heart pounding. When he emerged, she held up her wallet. All my cards were declined. He frowned, concerned. That's strange. Must be fraud protection. I'll call the bank Monday. It's Tuesday. Right. I'll handle it today. He kissed her forehead. Don't worry, use cash. She didn't have cash. She hadn't needed it in years. Shane transferred her $500, enough for groceries, not enough to leave. The second catastrophe struck 3 days later. Clara's mother lived in a memory care facility in Glendale. Early-stage dementia. The staff was kind, the rooms clean, the cost astronomical, $12,000 a month. Shane had insisted on paying. The director called Clara on Friday afternoon. Mrs. Matthews, we need to discuss your mother's account. Clara's throat tightened. Is something wrong? You're 3 months past due. We've been patient, but if the balance isn't settled by Monday, we'll need to make other arrangements. That's impossible. My husband pays directly. Ma'am, we haven't received a payment since January. Clara hung up. Her hands shook so violently she dropped her phone. Shane was in San Francisco for a board meeting. She called him 6 times. He didn't answer. When he finally called back, his voice was smooth. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Accounting error. I'll wire the money tonight. He didn't. Clara's mother was evicted the following week. The third catastrophe destroyed her last ally. Owen had been working on an expose about Matthews Pharma for 18 months. Internal documents, whistleblower testimony, evidence that the company had known their opioids were twice as addictive as competitors and had hidden the data. 40,000 deaths, families destroyed, communities gutted. The story was set to run in the Atlantic's June issue. Then, without explanation, it was killed. Owen called Clara, furious. They threatened the magazine. Legal action. Advertising boycotts. My editor caved. Who threatened them? Your husband's family. Clara, your father-in-law buried my story the same way he buried 40,000 bodies? She wanted to argue, to defend Shane, but the words wouldn't come. That night, Clara made a decision. She would leave. Owen had offered his apartment in Silver Lake. She'd stay there until the baby was born, then figure out custody, divorce, survival. She packed a small bag while Shane was at the gym. Clothes, toiletries, her mother's jewelry. She drove her Tesla toward the Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean glittering under moonlight. 5 miles from Owen's apartment, the car stopped. No warning, no error message. The dashboard went black. The steering wheel locked. Clara coasted to the shoulder, cars screaming past at 70 miles per hour. She was 6 months pregnant, alone in the dark, on one of the most dangerous stretches of road in Los Angeles. She called Owen. He arrived 20 minutes later, white-faced with rage. He disabled it remotely. Tesla owners can do that through the app. Clara stared at her dead car. He knew. Of course he knew. Owen drove her to his apartment. But when they pulled into the parking garage, 2 police cars were waiting, lights flashing, officers approaching with hands on their holsters. Clara Bennett. She nodded, confused. Your husband filed a missing person report. He says you're having a mental breakdown, that you've threatened to harm yourself and the baby. That's insane. I'm leaving him because, ma'am, we have a court order for a 72-hour psychiatric hold. You need to come with us. Owen exploded. She's not crazy. Her husband is abusing her. The officer's expression was sympathetic but firm. Sir, step back. This is a medical emergency. They took Clara to Cedars-Sinai. Not the emergency room, the psychiatric wing, locked doors, security guards, patients screaming in distant rooms. A nurse checked her vitals. A social worker asked questions Clara couldn't answer. Do you feel safe? Have you had thoughts of harming yourself? Do you hear voices, though? Grace Palmer arrived 2 hours later. She was Clara's obstetrician, 52 years old, with silver hair and the steady voice of someone who'd seen everything. She examined Clara in silence, then closed the door. I don't believe him. Clara burst into tears. But I can't get you out without a judge's order. You'll be here for 72 hours unless we can expedite a hearing. He's going to take my baby. Dean Palmer's jaw tightened. Not if I have anything to say about it. Owen worked his connections, called lawyers, journalists, anyone who owed him favors. 36 hours later, an emergency hearing was scheduled. The judge was a black woman in her 60s, reading glasses perched on her nose. She reviewed the psychiatric evaluation, the hospital records, Shane's statement. Then she looked at Clara. Mrs. Matthews, did you threaten to harm yourself or your unborn child? No, Your Honor. Why did you leave your home? Clara hesitated. The room was silent. Shane's lawyer sat in the back row, taking notes. If she said the wrong thing, she'd lose everything. I needed space. The judge studied her for a long moment. Then she signed an order. The hold is terminated. Mrs. Matthews is free to go. Clara walked out of that courthouse thinking she'd won. She had no idea the real nightmare was just beginning. Shane was waiting outside the courthouse. Sunglasses, charcoal suit, the image of a concerned husband. When Clara emerged, he opened his arms. I'm so sorry. I panicked when you left. I thought you were in danger. Every camera in Los Angeles captured their reunion. Shane Matthews, billionaire CEO, embracing his pregnant wife. The perfect picture of reconciliation. Clara felt like she was drowning. Dr. Palmer pulled her aside. Your blood pressure is dangerously high. If you don't reduce stress, you could go into preterm labor. How do I reduce stress when my husband is trying to destroy me? By playing the game long enough to get out safely. 2 weeks later, Shane insisted Clara attend the Matthews Foundation charity gala. It was the social event of the season. A-list celebrities, tech moguls, politicians, all gathered to celebrate the foundation's $50 million donation to maternal health initiatives. The same initiatives Clara had founded. Everyone thinks you're unstable, Shane said, his hand resting possessively on her back. You need to show them you're fine, that we're fine. Clara knew it was a trap, but she also knew resistance would make things worse. So she wore the ivory maternity gown Shane's stylist selected. She smiled for the cameras. She played the role of devoted wife. The ballroom at the Peninsula was stunning. Chandeliers dripped crystal. Orchids towered on every table. A string quartet played Vivaldi. Clara stood beside Shane, her hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick anxiously. Then Vivian Drake entered. She was 32, a corporate attorney, with auburn hair and the kind of beauty that stops conversations. She wore a crimson gown that hugged every curve. Every man in the room turned to stare. Shane's mistress, Clara had suspected, had seen the hotel receipts, the jewelry charges, the gaps in his schedule, but suspicion and confirmation are different beasts. Vivian approached them with a champagne flute and a predatory smile. Clara, Shane talks about you constantly. It's so wonderful to finally meet. Clara forced herself to shake Vivian's hand. Likewise, I'm the lead attorney on the foundation merger. Shane and I have been working so closely. Long nights, you know how it is. Her eyes glittered with malice. Shane's hand tightened on Clara's waist. A warning. At 8 o'clock, Shane took the stage. The room fell silent as he spoke about the importance of maternal health, about giving back, about building a legacy. He credited Vivian as the visionary behind this transformative initiative. The initiative Clara had built with her own hands. Clara felt nauseous. She excused herself, walking carefully through the crowd toward the restrooms. In the mirror, she looked like a ghost, pale, hollow-eyed, 6 months pregnant and utterly alone. When she returned to the ballroom, Vivian was standing near the dessert table. Their eyes met. Vivian's smile was sharp. Clara, you look exhausted. Are you feeling all right? I'm fine. Vivian moved closer, her voice dropping. Shane told me about your breakdown, how scary that must have been. But don't worry, we're taking such good care of you. The rage that surged through Clara was white hot. Stay away from my husband. Your husband, Vivian laughed softly. Honey, he stopped being yours the moment you got pregnant. She turned, her heel catching the train of Clara's dress. Wine spilled, red as blood across the ivory fabric. Clara instinctively bent to dab the stain, and that's when it happened. Vivian's stiletto heel pressed into Clara's stomach. Not an accident, not a stumble, a deliberate, calculated act of violence. Clara felt the pressure, the sharp edge of the heel against her womb. She gasped, pain radiating through her abdomen. The baby kicked frantically, a desperate flutter against the assault. Help, Clara whispered, then louder. Help. She looked up at Shane. He was standing 10 feet away, watching. His expression was cold, distant, as if she were a stranger making a scene. Shane, help me. He turned to security. Get her out of here. She's making a scene. Clara's vision blurred. She felt wetness between her legs. Blood or amniotic fluid. She couldn't tell. The pain was unbearable. She collapsed to the marble floor, her hands clutching her belly, and the cameras captured everything. Owen had arrived late to the gala, suspicious of Shane's sudden desire for reconciliation. He stood in the back of the ballroom, phone raised, recording every second. Within an hour, the video was online. Within 6 hours, 47 million people had watched it. The hashtag Justice for Clara trended worldwide. Shane Matthews' empire began to crumble. Clara woke in a hospital bed. White walls, beeping machines, the antiseptic smell of survival. Daughter, Palmer stood beside her, checking monitors with practiced efficiency. The baby? Heartbeat is weak but stable. You're on bed rest for the foreseeable future. Clara closed her eyes, relief flooding through her. She's okay. For now, but Clara, if there's another incident like this, there won't be. Owen's voice came from the doorway. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his jaw, but his expression was fierce. The world knows what he did. The video had exploded beyond anything Owen could have predicted. News networks played it on loop. Celebrities demanded justice. Think pieces dissected toxic masculinity and the vulnerability of pregnant women. Shane's company, Matthews Pharma, saw its stock plummet 34% in a single day. Within 48 hours, Vivian Drake was arrested. The charge assault with a deadly weapon. Under California law, her heel qualified. The fact that Clara was pregnant elevated it to attempted murder of a fetus under Penal Code 187. Detective Margot Reeves handled the case. She was 42, a 20-year veteran of the LAPD, with cropped gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She interviewed Clara at the hospital. Mrs. Matthews, walk me through what happened. Clara recounted every detail. The spilled wine, the deliberate pressure, Shane's refusal to help. And your husband's response. He told security to remove me. Reeves wrote notes without expression. The video supports your account. We've arrested Ms. Drake. She'll be arraigned tomorrow. Given the public attention, the DA is pushing for maximum charges. For the first time in months, Clara felt a flicker of hope. The arraignment was a media circus. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Vivian arrived in handcuffs, her crimson dress replaced by an orange jumpsuit. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. The judge set bail at $500,000. Shane paid it within the hour. But the case was moving forward. The DA's office was under immense pressure. This wasn't just assault. It was a cultural flashpoint. Pregnant women assaulted by mistresses while their husbands stood by. It was every woman's nightmare. Clara allowed herself to believe justice might actually happen. Then, 2 weeks later, everything fell apart. Judge Bradley Holt called an emergency hearing. He was 58, silver-haired, with the polished demeanor of someone who'd spent decades in expensive courtrooms. He reviewed the evidence with theatrical skepticism. The prosecution's case relies entirely on a cell phone video recorded by the plaintiff's brother, a video that could easily be manipulated with modern technology. Furthermore, the security footage from the venue has been corrupted. Without corroborating evidence, I find insufficient grounds to proceed. Clara's lawyer shot to his feet. Your Honor, the video has been authenticated by 3 independent experts. Deepfake technology is sophisticated. Counselor, I will not allow this court to be used for a public lynching based on questionable evidence. All charges are dismissed. The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Owen swore loudly enough that bailiffs approached. Clara sat frozen, unable to process what she just heard. Vivian Drake walked out of that courthouse a free woman. That night, Owen dug into Judge Holt's background. It took him 4 hours to find the connection. Holt had served on the board of a nonprofit funded by the Matthews Foundation. He'd received $200,000 in consulting fees over 3 years. He's bought, Owen told Clara. Every judge in Los Angeles is either afraid of the Matthews family or in their pocket. 3 new disasters followed in rapid succession. First, Clara's mother was evicted from the memory care facility. Not just for non-payment, Shane had forged Clara's signature on financial power of attorney documents, making himself legally responsible for her mother's care. Then he'd withdrawn that authorization, leaving her mother with nowhere to go. Second, Shane filed for divorce. The papers included a prenuptial agreement Clara had never seen, let alone sign, but there it was, her signature, perfectly forged. According to the prenup, she was entitled to nothing. No house, no money, no custody rights until after the baby was born. Third, Owen lost his job. The Atlantic cited conflict of interest for filming his sister without disclosing their relationship. But Owen knew the real reason. Matthews Pharma was one of the magazine's largest advertisers. Clara found herself in a motel room in Burbank. Owen was paying, but he was nearly broke himself. Ruby, his wife, had left him after the scandal. His career was in shambles. He'd sacrificed everything to protect Clara, and she'd brought him nothing but ruin. That night, alone in the dark, Clara held the bottle of anxiety medication Dr. Palmer had prescribed. 30 pills. She Googled how many it would take. Not to hurt the baby, just to make the pain stop. She sat there for 3 hours, the pills in her palm, feeling the baby kick against her ribs. Then her phone rang. Dr. Palmer. Clara, I need you to listen very carefully. Dr. Palmer arrived at the motel at midnight. She parked 2 blocks away, hood up, moving like someone who knew she was being watched. When Clara opened the door, the doctor's face was grim. I could lose my license for what I'm about to do. She handed Clara a USB drive. Shane's medical records. I shouldn't have access to them, but I've been his physician for 15 years. I know things. Clara plugged the drive into her laptop. Files appeared. Prescriptions, lab results, surgical records. Dr. Palmer pointed to a document dated 4 years earlier. Shane had a vasectomy. Clara's blood went cold. But he's been getting Viagra prescriptions for 3 years. He's been sexually active, just not with the intent to conceive. Then how am I pregnant? Dr. Palmer pulled up another file. Fertility clinic records. Shane's been telling people you cheated, that the baby isn't his. I've heard the rumors at social events. He's been preparing this narrative for months. Clara felt the room tilt. But I didn't cheat. I know. Which means Shane's been lying about his vasectomy. Or, De Palmer hesitated. There's another possibility. She opened a second folder. DNA analysis. The kind done during routine prenatal screening. I ran the paternity test as part of standard genetic screening. The results are unusual. Clara's hands shook as she read. The genetic markers didn't match Shane, but they showed a familial relationship. Close. Too close. I don't understand, Dr. Palmer's voice was gentle. The biological father is a first-degree relative of yours. Brother, father, or... The memory hit Clara like a freight train. 3 years ago, her 30th birthday. She'd just miscarried her first pregnancy from a previous relationship. She was devastated, drunk, sobbing in Owen's apartment. Owen had held her, and then Clara's voice came out strangled. Owen is adopted. Yes, I checked after seeing these results. Owen Bennett was adopted from foster care at age 6. No biological relation to you. Clara remembered waking up in Owen's guest room, both of them clothed but disoriented. They'd never spoken about it. Both had assumed nothing happened. Both had been too ashamed to ask. Oh God, Dr. Palmer gripped Clara's hand. Shane knows. That's why he married you. That's why Walter allowed it. They've been waiting for you to get pregnant so they could weaponize this. Why? Because you're Walter Matthews' daughter. The room went silent except for the hum of the motel's air conditioning. Dr. Palmer pulled up one more document, a wire transfer from 28 years ago, $500,000 from Matthews Pharma to Clara's mother's account. The memo line confidential settlement. Your mother had an affair with Walter? You're Shane's half-sister. The marriage was incestuous from the beginning. And the baby, Palmer's voice cracked. The baby has a 70% chance of severe genetic complications. Clara's entire world shattered. She wasn't just betrayed by her husband. She'd been engineered. Her whole life was a lie constructed by Walter Matthews to contain a scandal. And now she was carrying a child whose very existence was a genetic disaster. Why are you telling me this? Dr. Palmer's eyes filled with tears. Because I'm tired of watching powerful men destroy women. And because you deserve to know the truth before you make your next decision. What decision? Whether to carry this pregnancy to term. Clara looked down at her belly. The baby kicked, oblivious to the horror of her origins. A child conceived in incest. A child with genetic defects. A child whose existence would destroy everyone Clara loved. I can't terminate. I'm too far along. California allows termination up to viability in cases of fetal abnormality or maternal health risk. You qualify for both. Clara felt like she was falling through space. What do I do? That's your choice. But Clara, you need to understand something. Walter Matthews knew this would happen. He orchestrated your marriage to Shane because he wanted to ensure that if you ever got pregnant, the child would be so genetically compromised that it couldn't survive. It was his way of erasing you. Then why not just kill me? Because murder is messy. But letting nature take its course, that's just tragedy. Clara sat on the stained motel bedspread, the USB drive glowing in the darkness. She had two choices: terminate the pregnancy and lose the only thing she had left, or carry to term and watch her baby suffer. Neither was survival. Both were surrender. She called Owen. Owen arrived within 20 minutes. When Clara told him everything, he didn't speak for a full minute. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and put his fist through the glass. Blood dripped from his knuckles. His voice was hollow. We slept together. We don't remember it. That doesn't matter. I'm the father. You're adopted. We're not biologically related. But everyone will think we are. Ruby already left me. If this gets out, I'll lose my kids. They'll call me a predator. Clara felt her heart break for the second time that night. I'm so sorry. Don't. Owen wrapped his bleeding hand in a towel. This isn't your fault. This is Walter's plan. He wanted us to destroy each other. What do I do? Owen's jaw tightened. We go to Walter. The Matthews estate was in Hancock Park, a sprawling mansion behind iron gates. Owen drove them there at 3 in the morning. Security tried to turn them away, but Clara screamed from the passenger seat. I have your son's medical records. Either Walter talks to me or I send them to every news outlet in America. The gates opened. Walter Matthews met them in his study. He was 70 years old, white-haired, with the cold blue eyes Clara had inherited. He poured himself a scotch and waited. Clara threw the USB drive on his desk. You knew. I knew many things. I'm your daughter. Wade, Walter smiled. Yes. And you let me marry Shane, so I encouraged it. Why the Walter sipped his scotch. Because you were a problem. Your mother got pregnant during our affair. She threatened to expose me. I paid her off. But you were still out there, a living reminder of my mistakes. When Shane expressed interest in marrying you, I saw an opportunity. To do what? To contain you. If you married into the family, any children you had would be legally Matthews' heirs. But if those children were genetically compromised, they wouldn't survive long enough to inherit. Problem solved. Clara felt bile rise in her throat. You wanted my baby to die. I wanted you to understand your place. Women like your mother think they can trap men like me with pregnancies. I've spent 50 years proving them wrong. Owen lunged. Walter's security stopped him before he reached the desk. Walter remained calm. Here's what's going to happen. Clara will terminate the pregnancy. She'll sign a non-disclosure agreement. She'll receive $10 million, and we'll all move on. And if I don't, Walter's smile was razor sharp, then I'll release the paternity results. The world will know you committed incest with your adopted brother. You'll be arrested for fraud, for forging documents, for anything I can invent. Owen will lose his children. Your mother will lose her facility permanently. And the baby will die anyway, slowly and painfully, from the genetic defects she's already carrying. Clara looked at Owen. His face was ashen. Walter stood. You have 24 hours to decide. They left. In the car, Clara couldn't stop shaking. He's right. If we fight him, everyone loses. Owen's voice was broken. Then we don't fight him. What? We give him what he wants. You take the money. You sign the NDA. You disappear. And the baby, Owen's silence was answer enough. Clara spent that night in Owen's apartment, staring at the ceiling. At dawn, she felt the baby kick. Strong, insistent, alive. She thought about the genetic tests, the 70% chance of defects, the likelihood of suffering. She thought about her mother, losing her mind in a state facility, about Owen, losing his children, about herself, losing everything. And she thought about Walter Matthews, sitting in his mansion, confident that he'd won. At 9 a.m., Clara called Finn Barrett. He was a paralegal who'd worked at Matthews Pharma for 6 months, quietly digitizing old files. Owen had interviewed him once for the opioid story. He'd seemed nervous, but honest. Finn, it's Clara Bennett. I need your help. That afternoon, Finn arrived with a box of documents. I've been scanning these for weeks. They're supposed to be shredded, but I made copies. I don't know if they're useful, but... Clara opened the box. Inside were decades of Matthews Pharma internal memos. And there, at the bottom, was a file labeled Personal Walter Matthews. And inside was a confession, handwritten, dated 2 weeks ago. To whom it may concern, I am 70 years old. I have terminal lung cancer. I am writing this to clear my conscience before I die. Clara read faster, her pulse accelerating. 28 years ago, I had an affair with a woman named Elizabeth Bennett. She became pregnant. I paid her $500,000 to disappear. The child, Clara, was raised believing her father was Elizabeth's husband. Clara is my biological daughter. Years later, my son Shane expressed interest in marrying Clara. I encouraged this union despite knowing the biological relationship. My intent was to ensure that any offspring would be genetically compromised and unable to challenge my estate. This was wrong. I take full responsibility. I am a monster. The confession was signed and notarized. Clara looked up at Finn, tears streaming down her face. Why are you giving this to me? Because I've been scanning documents that show your father-in-law killed 40,000 people and got away with it. And I'm tired of watching rich men win. Clara held the confession like a grenade. She had the power to destroy Walter Matthews, to expose him, to watch his empire burn. But using it meant exposing herself, exposing Owen, exposing the baby. The world would know everything. She looked at Owen. What do I do? He took her hand. That's your choice. But Clara, whatever you decide, I'm with you. Clara sat in Owen's apartment, the confession on the coffee table between them. Outside, Los Angeles was waking up. Traffic hummed, birds sang. The world moved forward, indifferent to the bomb she held in her hands. If I release this, Walter goes down, but so do we. Owen nodded slowly. The paternity results will come out. People will know about us. They'll call it incest, even though we're not biologically related. You'll lose your kids. I've already lost them. Ruby filed for full custody yesterday. Clara's heart broke. Because of me. Because of him. Owen pointed to the confession. Walter Matthews has spent 50 years destroying people. If we don't stop him now, he'll keep going. But the baby bomb will be born into a world where people know the truth. That's hard, but it's better than being born into a lie. Clara placed a hand on her belly. The baby kicked, as if voting. She thought about all the women who'd been destroyed by men like Walter, the families shattered by opioids, the mothers who'd lost children, the wives discarded when they became inconvenient. She thought about the viral video. 47 million people watching her collapse. 47 million people who demanded justice. And she thought about the question Dr. Palmer had asked. What kind of world do you want your daughter to be born into? Clara made her choice. She called a press conference. Every major news outlet attended. The room was packed with cameras, reporters, and curious onlookers. Clara sat at a table, 6 months pregnant, with Owen beside her. Dr. Palmer stood in the back, ready to provide medical testimony. Clara began to speak. My name is Clara Bennett. 3 weeks ago, a video of me being assaulted at a charity gala went viral. You watched me collapse. You watched my husband refuse to help. You demanded justice. The room was silent. Today, I'm here to tell you the full story, not just about that night, about the 50 years of corruption, abuse, and violence that led to it. She held up the confession. This is a notarized statement from Walter Matthews, written 2 weeks ago. In it, he admits that I am his biological daughter from an affair with my mother. He admits that he encouraged my marriage to his son, my half-brother, despite knowing the biological relationship, and he admits that he did this intentionally to ensure any children I bore would be genetically compromised and unable to inherit his estate. Gasps rippled through the room. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Clara continued, her voice steady. My pregnancy was not an accident. It was the result of a one-night encounter with my adopted brother, Owen Bennett, during a time of intense grief. We did not know we were not biologically related. We did not know Walter Matthews was setting a trap. She looked directly at the cameras. I am 6 months pregnant with a child who has a 70% chance of severe genetic complications. I am carrying this pregnancy to term because I refuse to let Walter Matthews dictate who lives and who dies. But I am also here to ensure that what happened to me never happens to another woman. She pulled out the second USB drive. This contains 50 years of internal documents from Matthews Pharma, evidence of opioid manipulation, bribery, fraud, and a systematic pattern of destroying anyone who threatened the Matthews empire. Clara slid the drive across the table to Detective Reeves, who'd been sitting quietly in the front row. I'm pressing charges, not just for the assault at the gala, for conspiracy, for fraud, for every crime Walter and Shane Matthews have committed. The room erupted. Questions flew like bullets. But Clara stood, her hand on her belly, and walked out. Outside, the sunshine was blinding. Owen put his arm around her. That took courage. Or stupidity. Sometimes they're the same thing. The fallout was immediate and brutal. By evening, every major network was covering the story. Incest, corruption, a billionaire dynasty built on death. The hashtag Matthews crime family trended for 3 days. Walter Matthews was arrested that night at his estate, charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery, racketeering. His bail was set at $50 million. Shane Matthews was arrested the following morning, charged with conspiracy and aiding and abetting. The pharmaceutical company's board voted to remove him as CEO within hours. Vivian Drake was rearrested. New charges: conspiracy to commit assault. The judge who'd dismissed the original case was investigated, and within a week, evidence of bribery emerged. But Clara's life didn't get easier. The media descended like locusts. Reporters camped outside Owen's apartment. Paparazzi followed her to doctor's appointments. Strangers left hateful comments on every article. She's lying for attention. Incest is incest, adopted or not. That baby should be aborted. Ruby filed an emergency motion to terminate Owen's parental rights. Citing moral turpitude, a judge granted the supervised visitation only. Clara's mother, lost in the fog of dementia, was moved to a state facility. She didn't recognize Clara during visits. And the baby. The genetic test came back. Severe heart defect, underdeveloped lungs, a 50% chance of survival past the first year. Dr. Palmer sat with Clara in the examination room, the ultrasound images glowing on the screen. I won't lie to you. This will be hard. She'll need multiple surgeries, round-the-clock care. There are no guarantees. Clara stared at the tiny heartbeat flickering on the monitor. But there's a chance. There's always a chance. That night, Clara wrote a letter to her daughter. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you'll live long enough to understand, but I need you to know that you were wanted, not by the people who created you, but by me. Your grandfather tried to make you a tragedy. He wanted you to die as proof that women like your grandmother and me don't matter, that we're disposable. But you're not a tragedy. You're a revolution. And whatever happens, I will fight for you every single day until my last breath. She folded the letter and placed it in a box with the ultrasound photos, the confession, and the USB drive. Evidence, memory, hope. The trial of Walter Matthews began 6 months later. Clara had given birth 3 weeks earlier. Her daughter, Grace, weighed 4 pounds and was in the NICU at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. She'd already undergone 2 surgeries. The doctor said she was a fighter. Clara attended the trial every day, pumping breast milk during recesses, sleeping in the hospital at night. She looked like a ghost, but she never missed a session. The prosecution built their case methodically. Financial records, internal memos, testimony from whistleblowers who'd been silenced for decades. Finn Barrett took the stand and walked the jury through 50 years of corruption. Walter's defense was simple. He was a dying old man. The confession was written under duress, influenced by painkillers and dementia. He couldn't be held responsible for decisions made by his son. Shane testified against his father. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he detailed everything: the plan to marry Clara, the forged prenup, the coordination with Judge Holt, the assault at the gala. Vivian Drake took a plea deal. She admitted to assault and conspiracy. In exchange for testifying against Shane, she received 5 years. But the moment that changed everything came when Dr. Palmer took the stand. The defense attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit, tried to discredit her. Dr. Palmer, isn't it true that you violated HIPAA by accessing Shane Matthews' medical records without consent? Yes. And you gave those records to Minda Matthews, knowing it was illegal? Yes. So you're asking this jury to trust a doctor who breaks the law? Palmer looked directly at the jury. I'm asking this jury to understand that sometimes the law protects the wrong people. I took an oath to do no harm. Watching a pregnant woman be systematically destroyed while I had information that could save her, that was harm. So yes, I broke the law, and I'd do it again. The courtroom fell silent. The defense attorney tried to recover. You realize this confession could cost you your medical license? Yes, but Clara's daughter is alive because I made that choice. That's worth more than my career. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Guilty on all counts. Walter Matthews was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He would die there, Sandy. Shane Matthews received 10 years. Vivian Drake began her sentence immediately. But the legal victory felt hollow. Clara's life was ruins. Owen had lost his job, his marriage, his children. Dr. Palmer's medical license was suspended pending investigation. Finn Barrett was blacklisted from every law firm in California. And baby Grace was still fighting for every breath in the NICU. 3 months after the trial, Clara sat beside Grace's incubator. The baby was hooked to machines, her tiny chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. Clara sang softly, the same lullaby her mother used to sing. Dr. Palmer entered quietly. How is she? Stable. They're talking about a 3rd surgery next month. And you? Clara's laugh was bitter. I'm surviving. Barely. Dr. Palmer sat down. I got the board's decision today. They're permanently revoking my license. I'm so sorry. Don't be. I made my choice. She looked at Grace. She's beautiful. She's everything. They sat in silence, watching the baby sleep. Finally, Dr. Palmer spoke. Was it worth it? Destroying your life to expose them? Clara thought about the question, about the trial, about the men in prison, about the families who finally had closure for their loved ones who died from opioids. Ask me in 20 years. Dr. Palmer smiled sadly. Fair enough. 6 months later, Grace was released from the hospital. She still needed oxygen at night and daily physical therapy, but she was alive, thriving, even. Clara moved to Portland, Oregon. She couldn't afford Los Angeles anymore. She got a job at a domestic violence shelter, using her story to help other women escape. Owen visited once a month. He'd published a book about the case, a moderate bestseller. He was drinking too much, but he was functional. Ruby had remarried. His kids were teenagers now, barely speaking to him. Do you regret it? Clara asked him during one visit. Every day, Owen admitted. but I'd still do it again. 1 year after the trial, Clara received a package. No return address. Inside was a USB drive and a note. I'm sorry, Dr. Clara plugged it in the drive. It contained decades of additional Matthews Pharma files, evidence the prosecution hadn't used, proof of crimes that could destroy even more powerful people, and a final message from Walter Matthews, recorded days before his death from cancer. Clara, by the time you see this, I'll be gone. I spent 70 years building an empire on the bodies of people I considered beneath me. You were supposed to be another casualty. Instead, you became the one thing I never anticipated, a threat. I'm giving you this because I want you to understand something. You won, not because you destroyed me, but because you survived. And survival, in a world built to crush women like you, is the ultimate victory. Use these files or don't. That's your choice. But know that you changed the world, and I died hating you for it. The recording ended. Clara sat in her small Portland apartment, Grace sleeping in the next room, outside. Rain tapped against the windows. She looked at the USB drive, evidence that could destroy more lives, start new investigations, reopen old wounds, or she could destroy it, let the past stay buried. She thought about what Dr. Palmer had asked. Was it worth it? Clara plugged the drive into her laptop and began uploading files to a secure server. She sent links to journalists she trusted, to prosecutors, to victims' advocacy groups. Then she deleted the drive and threw it away. Grace cried from the bedroom. Clara went to her, lifting her daughter carefully. The baby looked up at her with bright eyes, curious and alive. Your grandfather wanted you to be a tragedy, Clara whispered, but you're going to be so much more. She carried Grace to the window. The rain had stopped. The city lights glimmered in the distance. Survival wasn't victory, but it was a start. Portland in autumn was beautiful. The leaves turned gold and crimson, carpeting the sidewalks in color. Clara walked as she carried Grace to daycare every morning, the 2-year-old chattering about everything and nothing. Grace had Owen's dark hair and Clara's stubborn chin. She'd had 4 surgeries in her short life, but she was thriving now. The doctors called her a miracle. Clara called her proof that monsters don't always win. The domestic violence shelter where Clara worked had promoted her to director. She spent her days helping women escape situations she understood too intimately. Some recognized her from the news. Most didn't. She preferred it that way. Owen visited less frequently now. He'd remarried, a kind woman who worked at a library. Ruby had eventually let him have supervised visits with his kids. He was sober. Mostly. Dr. Palmer lived 3 blocks away. She'd never practiced medicine again, but she volunteered at free clinics. Sometimes she and Clara had coffee, talking about anything except the past. The Matthews empire was gone. The pharmaceutical company had been sold, broken into pieces, redistributed. The foundation was dissolved. The family name was synonymous with corruption, but the world moved on. New scandals, new villains, new victims. Clara tried not to think about it. She focused on Grace, on work, on building a life from the ashes. Then, one November morning, an envelope arrived. Heavy paper, expensive. Inside was an invitation. The California State Senate cordially invites you to testify on Senate Bill 847, the Maternal Protection Act. Clara's hands shook as she read. The bill would create mandatory reporting requirements for pregnancy-related assaults, increase penalties for domestic violence against pregnant women, establish legal protections that could have saved her. If it passed, Clara's nightmare would prevent thousands of others. She called Owen. They want me to testify. Will you? Clara looked at Grace, playing with blocks on the floor. I don't know if I can go back. Then don't. You've given enough. But that night, Clara couldn't sleep. She thought about the women at the shelter, the ones who came in with broken bones and broken spirits, the ones who asked, how did you survive? She thought about Dr. Palmer, who'd sacrificed her career, about Finn Barrett, who'd lost everything to do the right thing, about Owen, who'd burned his life down to protect her. She thought about the 47 million people who'd watched her collapse and demanded justice. And she thought about Grace, asleep in the next room, breathing steady and strong. At dawn, Clara booked a flight to Sacramento. The hearing room was packed. Senators sat at a raised dais. Reporters filled the back rows. Advocates wore purple, the color of domestic violence awareness. Clara took the stand. She wore a simple blue dress, no makeup, her hair pulled back. She looked like what she was, a survivor. The committee chair, a woman in her 60s, spoke gently. Ms. Bennett, thank you for being here. We know this is difficult. Clara nodded. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened the night of the gala? Clara took a breath. Then she told the story. Not the sanitized version from the trial, the real one. The fear, the helplessness. The moment she thought her baby would die while her husband watched. The room was silent except for the sound of a senator quietly crying. And after, the chair asked, after, I learned that survival isn't enough. The system that failed me fails thousands of women every year. Pregnant women are twice as likely to be murdered by intimate partners as non-pregnant women. But there are almost no specific legal protections. If this bill had existed, would it have helped you? Clara thought carefully. Maybe, or maybe I still would have been trapped. But other women without viral videos or famous brothers or resources. Yes, this would save them. The opposition senator, a man with slicked back hair, leaned forward. Ms. Bennett, some argue this bill is government overreach, that we're criminalizing accidents. Clara met his eyes. Senator, when a woman is 6 months pregnant and someone presses a stiletto heel into her stomach hard enough to cause bleeding, that's not an accident. That's attempted murder. And the fact that we have to debate whether it deserves legal protection tells you everything about how we value women's lives. The room erupted in applause. The chair gavelled for order. After 3 hours of testimony, Clara stepped down and outside the building. Reporters swarmed. She gave no interviews. She just wanted to go home to Grace. But as she walked to her car, a woman approached. She was young, maybe 25, visibly pregnant. Ms. Bennett, I just wanted to say thank you. My boyfriend broke my jaw last month. The police said it was a domestic dispute, not a crime. But because of you, people are listening. Clara hugged her. Are you safe? I'm getting there. If you need help, call this number. Clara handed her a card for the Portland shelter. They'll protect you. The woman's eyes filled with tears. You changed my life. Clara watched her walk away, one hand protectively on her belly. And for the first time in 2 years, Clara felt something other than anger or fear. She felt hope. The bill passed 6 months later. Governor signed it into law with Clara standing behind him. The photo went viral again. But this time, the comments were different. She's a hero. This is what justice looks like. Clara Bennett saved my life. Clara didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who'd survived a war and was trying to make sure fewer people had to fight it. She went back to Portland, back to Grace, back to the quiet, ordinary life she'd built from ruins. But she kept the invitation on her fridge, a reminder that pain could become purpose, that survival could become salvation, and that sometimes the monsters don't win. 5 years after the gala, Clara Bennett stood in her kitchen making lunch for Grace. The 7-year-old was in first grade now, reading above her level, obsessed with dinosaurs. She had a scar on her chest from heart surgery and a stubborn independence that made Clara laugh and cry in equal measure. The house was small but warm, plants on the windowsill, photos on the walls, Grace's artwork covering the fridge. It wasn't the Malibu beach house. It was better. It was theirs. Clara's phone buzzed. A message from Owen. Turn on the news. She switched on the TV. A breaking news banner scrolled across the screen. Matthews Pharma whistleblower reveals new evidence in opioid crisis. A young woman stood at a podium, flanked by lawyers. She was holding a box of documents. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I worked at Matthews Pharma for 10 years. I was told to stay silent, but after watching Clara Bennett testify 5 years ago, I realized silence makes you complicit. These documents prove the company knew their opioids were deadly and chose profit over people. The camera zoomed in on her face. She looked terrified and determined. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Her phone rang. It was her, Palmer. Did you see? She cited you, said you gave her courage. Clara wiped her eyes. I was just trying to survive. That's exactly why it mattered. They talked for a while about Grace's school play, about Dirk Palmer's new volunteer work, about the ways life had quietly healed. When they hung up, Clara went to the closet and pulled down a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were the remnants of her old life, the ultrasound photos, the trial documents, the USB drive Walter had sent, and a single photograph from the gala, taken moments before everything fell apart. Clara in her ivory dress, hand on her belly, looking at something off camera. She was smiling, but her eyes were sad. She looked like a woman who knew a storm was coming. Grace wandered into the room. "Mama, who's that?" Clara looked at her daughter. "That's me. Before you were born, you looked different." "I was different." Grace studied the photo seriously. "Were you scared?" Clara thought about lying, about telling her daughter everything was fine, but Grace deserved the truth. "Yes, I was very scared. But you're not scared anymore." Clara pulled Grace into her lap. "Sometimes I'm still scared, but I'm also brave. You can be both." Grace nodded, satisfied, and ran back to her toys. Clara stared at the photograph. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she'd been in another lifetime. But she was also the foundation, the person who'd survived so Clara could become who she was now. She thought about all the women who'd reached out over the years, the ones who'd escaped because of the Maternal Protection Act, the ones who'd found courage in her story, the ones who were still fighting. And she thought about the question everyone asked. Was it worth it? Clara looked around her small, warm home. At Grace, laughing at something on TV. At the photos on the wall showing birthday parties and ordinary moments. At the life she'd built from nothing. The answer was complicated. She'd lost so much. Her marriage, Ifren, her family's reputation, her sense of safety. She'd been called a liar, a fraud, a woman who destroyed a good man. But she'd also gained something. Not justice, exactly. The courts had done that. But agency, the knowledge that she could be broken and still rebuild, that monsters could win battles and still lose wars. Clara put the photograph back in the box. She didn't need to look at it anymore. That woman had done her job. She'd survived. And in surviving, she'd changed the world just a little bit. That evening, Clara took Grace to the park. They swung on the swings, Grace shrieking with joy. An older woman on a nearby bench watched them and smiled. "Your daughter is beautiful." "Thank you." "She looks like you." Clara smiled. "People say that." The woman hesitated. "Are you? You're Clara Bennett, aren't you?" Clara's stomach tightened. She never knew how people would react. Some were kind, some were cruel. Some wanted to debate whether she'd done the right thing. "Yes." The woman stood and extended her hand. "My daughter was killed by her husband while she was pregnant, 8 years ago. The police called it domestic violence and gave him probation. He killed her 3 months later." Clara's throat closed. "The law that passed because of you. It's named after my daughter, Emily's law. I wanted to thank you." Clara took her hand. "I'm so sorry about Emily." "Me too, but because of you, other Emilys have a chance." They stood there in the fading sunlight, two women bound by tragedy, holding hands while children played in the background. That night, after Grace was asleep, Clara sat at her desk and wrote, not a memoir, not a manifesto, just a letter to the woman in the photograph. "You asked if it was worth it. If destroying your life to expose the truth was the right choice. I still don't know. Some days I think yes. Other days I think I could have been quieter, safer, smaller. But here's what I learned. Survival isn't binary. You don't just live or die. You live in the in-between. The space where you're broken and healing simultaneously. Where you're afraid and brave. Where you're a victim and a survivor. Grace asks about you sometimes, about the woman in the photograph. I tell her you were scared, but you fought anyway. That you fell and got back up. That you were human. And I want you to know, wherever you are in time, that it was worth it. Not because we won. We didn't. Not completely. But because we survived. And survival, in a world built to crush women like us, is revolutionary. Thank you for being brave when I couldn't be. For carrying me when I was too broken to walk. For refusing to disappear. We made it. Both of us. And that's enough." Clara folded the letter and placed it in the box with the photograph. Then she closed the lid and put it back in the closet. Tomorrow, she'd wake up and make Grace breakfast. She'd go to work and help women escape their own monsters. She'd live her quiet, ordinary life. But tonight, she stood at the window, looking out at the Portland skyline, and allowed herself to feel proud, not of destroying the Matthews empire, not of the viral video or the trial or the law, but of the 7-year-old sleeping in the next room, of the SARS they'd both survived, of the life they'd built in the wreckage. The monsters had tried to make them a tragedy. Instead, they'd become a revolution. And that, Clara thought as she turned off the lights, was worth every battle.